From the outside looking in, they seemed to have it all. A tidy brick house on a quiet street where neighbors wave from their driveways, the smell of barbecue drifting from the backyard on summer weekends, and a couple who always looked perfectly matched when they showed up to church on Sundays. He was the kind of man people trusted right away. Steady job, polite smile, the type who offered to fix a neighbor's leaky faucet without being asked. And she was beautiful in a way that felt timeless, carrying herself with elegance that made people whisper he was lucky to have her. To everyone around them, they looked like the picture of stability, the couple who had somehow figured out the secret to happiness in a world where marriages were falling apart left and right. But behind the curtains, not everything was as perfect as it appeared. He worked long hours, trying to provide more than just comfort. He wanted security, something permanent, something no one could ever take away. Every morning, he kissed his wife goodbye with a tenderness that was almost old-fashioned. He remembered anniversaries, brought flowers just because, and never once forgot to tell her she was beautiful. He lived for her approval, for the feeling of walking into a room and knowing she was his. For years, he thought that was enough. And maybe once upon a time, it had been. But marriage has a way of wearing down its shine, even when no one wants to admit it. She began to feel a restlessness she couldn't explain. The house was too quiet. The love, though steady, no longer felt thrilling. And when she looked at her husband, she saw devotion, but not the kind of wild desire that once made her heart race. It wasn't that she stopped loving him. It was that she started craving something else, something reckless, something that reminded her she was alive. She hid those thoughts well, smiling at him across the dinner table, leaning against his shoulder when they visited family, posting happy photos online. But in the corners of her mind, in the long hours when he was away, the hunger grew. The cracks were invisible to outsiders, but if you looked closely, you could see the signs. The way she lingered too long in conversation with his friends, laughing a little louder at their jokes, brushing a hand against an arm as though by accident. The way her eyes sparkled at parties, restless in a way that had nothing to do with the wine. His friends noticed, of course, but none of them said a word. Why would they? She was charming, magnetic even, and being the center of attention seemed harmless. And he, her husband, never questioned it. To him, those men weren't just friends. They were brothers. Men he'd grown up with, worked alongside, celebrated milestones with. They had been at his wedding. They had toasted with him when he bought his first home. They had carried him through tough times. He trusted them like family, maybe even more than family. That was the bond that made what came later so unthinkable. It wasn't just betrayal from a wife. It was betrayal from the very people he believed would take a bullet for him. And if you asked anyone in the neighborhood, they would have sworn those men and that woman would never cross such a line. But temptation has a way of finding cracks in loyalty, and once it slips through, it spreads like wildfire. In those quiet nights, while he worked late or dozed in front of the television, she was already living in the dangerous space between loyalty and desire. She told herself it was harmless, that nothing would ever come of it, that she would never cross that line. But desire doesn't stop just because we pretend it's under control. And when you mix desire with opportunity and opportunity with alcohol, you set the stage for disaster. The irony was that he still believed he was living the dream. He bragged about his wife's cooking, her beauty, the way she made their home warm. He looked around the table at his friends and thought, I'm lucky. I've got everything a man could want. He didn't realize in those very moments that the seeds of his downfall were already being planted by the woman he adored and by the men he would have defended with his life. By the time the storm hit, it would feel sudden, explosive, catastrophic. But the truth is, the cracks have been forming for years. And while he thought he was building a future of love and loyalty, She was already drifting toward a night that would shatter everything. It started out like any other Saturday night among friends. Music humming from a Bluetooth speaker, the smell of barbecue still hanging in the air, beer bottles clinking as laughter carried across the backyard. For years, this group had been inseparable. They had gone through college together, stood as best men at each other's weddings, carried one another through divorces and job losses. They weren't just friends. They were the kind of chosen family men hold on to when blood family isn't enough. The house was buzzing with energy. His wife moved through the crowd like she belonged to everyone, her laughter a little louder than usual, her smile a little too wide. She poured drinks with a playful tilt of her wrist, leaned in close when someone spoke, and brushed off the kind of touches that would have made her husband's blood boil had he been watching closely. But he wasn't. He trusted her, trusted them. That trust blinded him to the sparks already crackling beneath the surface. As the night wore on, the mood shifted. Shots of whiskey lined the counter. Music got louder. Jokes crossed lines. Someone pulled out an old college drinking game, and with it came the reckless energy of youth they thought they'd outgrown. Dares escalated. Boundaries blurred. She was right there in the center of it, her cheeks flushed, her eyes daring them to keep going. And they did. One by one, the men she had known for years, men who had hugged her at her wedding, men who had clapped her husband on the back in congratulations, gave in to temptation. At first, it was behind closed doors, the kind of whispered secret you think you can keep. But alcohol loosens shame, and soon secrecy turned into spectacle. The unthinkable was happening, and none of them stopped it. There's something disturbing about how quickly loyalty can collapse. These weren't strangers. These were his closest friends, men he had shared victories and failures with. And yet, in that haze of liquor and lust, they forgot every promise of brotherhood. They forgot the man who had trusted them. And she, his wife, didn't resist. In fact, she leaned into it, hungry for the rush of being desired by all of them at once. But in every group, there's always one who watches differently, one who enjoys chaos more than the act itself. He didn't just want her, he wanted to own the moment, to capture it. While the others were too consumed with desire to think beyond the next touch, he pulled out his phone. He filmed her laughter, the way she whispered each name, the tangled limbs, the proof of betrayal no one ever thought would see the light of day. And when the video was done, he didn't keep it for himself. He decided to send it to the one man who should never have seen it. Maybe it was jealousy. Maybe he resented his friend for having what he didn't. Or maybe it was cruelty, a sick kind of humor meant to destroy. Whatever the reason, in that moment, with his thumb hovering over send, he sealed all of their fates. While the rest of the group passed out drunk in the early hours of the morning, the phone buzzed on a nightstand miles away. And with that buzz, the fragile illusion of a happy marriage shattered forever. She had no idea the video was out there. She was still laughing, still basking in the glow of reckless abandon, while her husband was about to see everything. The friends who thought they could walk away from this night with their secrets intact didn't realize the evidence was already on its way to the one person they had betrayed the most. That night wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It wasn't just drunken infidelity. It was a turning point, a collision of lust, betrayal, and malice that would ignite something far darker. Because when trust is broken so completely, when humiliation is carved into a man's soul in high-definition video, the line between man and monster begins to blur. And for him, for the husband who would soon watch every second of that footage, the night wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The message came through just after midnight, a sharp buzz that cut through the quiet of the house. He was half asleep on the couch, the TV flickering muted late-night reruns. when his phone lit up on the coffee table. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe one of his buddies checking in after the party. Maybe his wife saying she'd be home late. But when he picked up the phone and saw the unknown number with a single video file attached, his stomach tightened. Curiosity got the better of him. He tapped. The screen filled with movement, grainy at first, then sharper as the camera adjusted to the dim light. And in an instant, the blood drained from his face. It was her, his wife. Her laugh, her voice, unmistakable. The kind of laugh he'd fallen in love with. Only now, it wasn't meant for him. She was with them, his friends. One, then another, then all of them. Tangled bodies, drunken grins, hands where they didn't belong. The camera shook as someone whispered crude jokes, mocking, reveling in the betrayal. He froze, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. At first, he told himself it had to be fake. Some sick prank, a look-alike, a cruel joke. But the longer he stared, the more denial crumbled. He recognized the room, the scuffed coffee table they had all gathered around hundreds of times. He recognized the voices, each one familiar, each one tied to memories of brotherhood. And then there was her necklace, the one he had given her for their anniversary. It gleamed in the shaky video, undeniable proof that this wasn't a dream, wasn't an illusion. It was real. His breath came shallow, chest tight, as if the walls of the living room had collapsed inward. Rage and grief crashed into him like waves, each one worse than the last. He replayed it once, twice, as if some part of him hoped it might change. But it never did. Every replay only deepened the wound, carving humiliation deeper into his soul. The betrayal cut on two fronts. The woman he had trusted above all else had crossed the line, and the men he had called brothers, men who had sworn loyalty over beers and promises, had taken part in it. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a conspiracy of silence, a collective knife in his back. He staggered into the kitchen, gripping the counter as nausea rose in his throat. His reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger, wild-eyed, broken. Images of the past slammed against him. Her smile on their wedding day, their first home, the way his friends had stood beside him in celebration after celebration. Now those same memories were poisoned. The laughter, the trust, the love, all of it felt like a cruel setup leading to this moment. The video hadn't just shown him sex. It had shown him contempt. The way they joked. The way she didn't hesitate. The casualness of it, like he didn't exist, like his devotion had been nothing but a joke shared behind his back. That, more than anything, burned. He dropped onto the floor, phone still in his hand, as tears blurred the screen. For hours, he sat there in the silence of his living room, replaying the nightmare, each time sinking deeper into the abyss. At one point, he hurled the phone across the room, but the damage had already been done. The images were seared into his mind. They would never leave. Humiliation is a dangerous fuel. Alone, it corrodes quietly. But mixed with anger, it can ignite into something uncontrollable. By dawn, humiliation had transformed into fury. He wasn't just betrayed, he had been mocked. Someone had filmed it, packaged it, and delivered it like a gift wrapped in barbed wire. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. They wanted him to see. They wanted him to break. And in a way, he did. Something inside him snapped, so subtle he didn't even feel it first. His hand stopped shaking. His tears dried. His breathing slowed, steady and purposeful. He stood, walked to the bedroom, and opened the drawer where he kept the handgun. As the weight of the metal settled into his palm, he wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't thinking about prison or justice or forgiveness. He was thinking about the laughter in that video, the betrayal in every frame, the faces of the men he had once trusted more than anyone else, and the woman he had thought he would grow old with. He placed the gun on the table beside an empty glass and sat back down, staring at it. The decision hadn't fully formed yet, but the seed was planted. And once planted, there was no going back. What he didn't know then was that the video wasn't just the end of his marriage or the end of his friendships. It was the spark that would ignite the kind of darkness most men never imagined themselves capable of. A darkness that, within hours, would leave blood on the floor and bodies in the morgue. The hours after he watched that video stretched on like an eternity. The house felt colder than it ever had, as if every memory inside those walls had turned on him. He sat in the dark, the television still flickering in the background, but he couldn't hear a thing. All he heard was the echo of laughter from the recording, the way his wife's voice cracked with delight in someone else's arms, the voices of his so-called friends egging her on. A glass of whiskey sat in front of him, the ice long since melted into nothing. He poured another, then another, but the burn in his throat did nothing to dull the fire inside his chest. Every swallow only fueled it. His mind raced through years of loyalty, of sacrifices, of blind trust. He saw their wedding day in flashes, her veil catching the sunlight, the way his best man had patted his shoulder, saying, "She's the one, man. You're lucky." He saw the nights he and his friends had played cards at that same kitchen table, laughing, swearing they'd always be there for each other. And then he saw the video again, even without a screen in front of him, as vivid as if it were burned into the back of his eyelids. The humiliation curdled into something darker. He had been made a fool of, not just by her, but by all of them. Together, they had taken everything he held sacred, his marriage, his friendships, his pride, and reduced it to a cruel joke. And the cruelest part? Someone had made sure he would know. Someone wanted him destroyed. He stumbled to his feet, pacing the living room like a caged animal. His thoughts came in fragments. Why? How could she? Why would they do this? He slammed his fist against the wall, the plaster cracking beneath his knuckles. But even the pain didn't bring him back. He was past pain, past reason. In the corner of the room sat the small oak cabinet where he kept his handgun locked away. For years, it had been nothing more than a precaution, a tool for protection in a dangerous world. He had never drawn it in anger, never once thought of using it against anyone he knew. But now, the world inside his head had shifted. He wasn't thinking about laws or morality. He was thinking about betrayal, about how much blood it would take to wash away the image of that video. His hands moved without hesitation. He unlocked the cabinet, pulled out the weapon, and felt its weight settle into his palm. It was heavier than he remembered, but also strangely comforting, like certainty made solid. He sat back down with the gun across his lap, staring at it while the clock ticked louder and louder in the silence. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of doubt. Could he really do it? Could he cross that line? He thought about simply leaving, packing a bag, walking away from all of it. But then he pictured their faces again, the smirks, the careless way they touched what was his. The shame was unbearable. He couldn't walk away. They had already taken too much. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, his decision was made. He cleaned himself up, washed his face, and put on the same jacket he always wore when heading out with his friends. If a neighbor saw him leave, they would have thought nothing of it. Just another morning, just another man starting his day. But inside his mind, the day had already ended. He wasn't going to work. He wasn't going to breakfast. He was going to settle a score. He loaded the gun carefully, methodically, as though he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times before. Each click of the magazine sliding into place echoed like a heartbeat. He slid it into the glove compartment of his car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. The streets were quiet, washed in the pale gray of early morning. To him, it felt like driving through a different world, one detached from the life he had lived until just hours ago. The radio stayed off. He didn't need noise. His mind was louder than any music could ever be. He knew exactly where they would be. That same house, that same living room, where the night before had descended into betrayal. They would still be there, half drunk, maybe even laughing about it all. And when he pictured walking through the door, when he imagined the shock on their faces, he felt something close to peace. It wasn't madness in the way movies portray it, screaming, wild eyes, incoherence. No, his madness was quiet, cold, and steady. The kind of madness that comes when a man has nothing left to lose. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. He cut the engine, sat in silence for a long moment, and then reached for the gun. The weight felt natural now, familiar, and in that instant, there was no turning back. The house was still alive with the remnants of last night's chaos. Empty bottles littered the porch, cigarette butts floated in half-drained beer cans, and somewhere inside, music still thumped faintly from a speaker that had been left running. It was the kind of scene you'd expect after a long night of drinking, except this wasn't just any morning after. For him, it was Judgment Day. He parked a block away, sat in the silence for a moment, and let the weight of what he was about to do sink in. But there was no turning back now. The betrayal had already carved him hollow. The only thing left inside was rage. He slid the gun into his jacket pocket, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the house with a calm that felt almost unnatural. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. His friends had never been careful. Why would they be? They thought they were untouchable, that nothing they did could have consequences. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Stale alcohol, sweat, the lingering stench of bodies crammed together in a drunken haze. He moved through the hallway, and with each step, the sound of voices grew louder. They were still awake, some of them laughing, others groaning as they tried to shake off hangovers. They didn't even notice him at first. And then someone turned, eyes widening. "Hey man, what are you?" The sentence never finished. The first gunshot shattered the room. A deafening crack, followed by screams. Glass shattered as someone stumbled into a table, bottles crashing to the floor. In that instant, chaos swallowed the house whole. He fired again, and again. The recoil jolted his arm, but his grip was steady. Each shot was fueled not by calculation, but by pure fury. Faces he had once trusted twisted in terror, mouths open in pleas that fell on deaf ears. He wasn't listening. He couldn't. One of them tried to run, scrambling toward the back door, but the shot caught him before he could make it out. Another dropped to his knees, hands up, begging for mercy. For a moment, just a flicker, the husband hesitated. This was a man he had called a brother. They had laughed together, bled together. But then the image of the video flashed in his mind, the sound of his wife's laughter echoing like a curse. The hesitation vanished. He pulled the trigger. The living room became a nightmare of screams, overturned furniture, and desperate scrambling. Someone hurled a bottle at him in a last-ditch attempt to fight back. It missed, shattering against the wall, showering glass across the floor. He responded with another shot, the thunder of the gun drowning out everything else. Upstairs, a door slammed. Someone was hiding. He could hear frantic footsteps, the creak of floorboards. He moved slowly up the staircase, every step deliberate, his shadow stretching long in the early morning light spilling through the windows. He reached the bedroom, kicked the door open, and found another of his so-called friends huddled in the corner, clutching a pillow as if it could shield him. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, the silence was suffocating. The friend whispered his name, voice trembling, as though that alone might undo what had already been set in motion. But names no longer mattered. Loyalty no longer mattered. Only betrayal. And with one more pull of the trigger, the silence was broken. By the time it was over, the house was unrecognizable. Smoke from the gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Bodies sprawled where laughter had echoed just hours earlier. Furniture lay overturned. Shattered glass crunched beneath his boots as he walked back through the carnage. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw her. His wife. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she was. Maybe she had stayed after the others passed out. Maybe she had come back looking for something she left behind. He froze when their eyes met. She looked terrified, hands trembling as she held them up, whispering his name the way she once did when they were in love. For a moment, the fury cracked. He saw her not as the woman in the video, not as the betrayer, but as the girl he had fallen in love with years ago. His chest tightened. His finger hovered uncertainly over the trigger. But then it came rushing back. The necklace in the video, the sound of her laugh with someone else, the look of pleasure that hadn't been for him. His vision blurred with rage all over again. She sobbed, pleading, promising, saying it had been a mistake. But the words bounced off him like raindrops against stone. He couldn't hear them. He couldn't believe them. The last thing he remembered before pulling the trigger was the way her eyes looked, wide, desperate, filled with a terror that mirrored his own emptiness. And just like that, she was gone too. Silence settled over the house. No more screams, no more running footsteps, no more desperate pleas. Only silence, broken by the distant bark of a dog outside, unaware of the horror, just yards away. He stood there for a long moment, breathing heavy, gun limp in his hand. It hadn't felt like justice. It hadn't felt like victory. It had felt inevitable, as though every step of his life had been leading here, to this house, this morning, this massacre. He walked back outside into the pale morning light. Birds were beginning to stir, the world waking as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. He climbed in his car, blood on his jacket, gun still warm in his hand. Somewhere, far in the distance, he could already hear the faint sound of sirens. The silence after the gunfire was almost deafening. The only sound left in the house was the steady drip of something spilling onto the hardwood floor, and the shallow breaths of a man who had crossed every line he once swore he'd never cross. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, gun heavy in his hand, staring at the devastation around him. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mingling with the bitter stench of spilled alcohol and blood. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. Curtains twitched as neighbors peeked out, drawn by the noise. A woman across the street, still in her robe, froze when she saw him stumble down the porch steps, his jacket stained dark. She didn't need to know the details. The look in his eyes told her enough. She backed away from the window and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The first sirens came minutes later, sharp, rising wails that cut through the calm of the morning. Flashing blue and red lights reflected against the quiet suburban houses, transforming the sleepy street into a crime scene. Patrol cars screeched to a stop, officers spilling out with weapons drawn, their voices loud and commanding. Drop the gun. Hands where we can see them. He didn't resist. The fight was gone from him now. The rage that had carried him here had burned itself out, leaving behind only emptiness. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the gun on the hood of his car and raised his hands. His jacket sleeves were smeared with blood, his face pale and hollow. Officers rushed forward, forcing him to the ground. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, and for the first time that morning, he felt something like clarity. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him, not in screams or tears, but in silence. He lay on the asphalt, cheek against the rough pavement, and stared at the line of ants marching along a crack in the driveway. It seemed almost absurd. how life carried on so normally, even as his own had imploded. Inside the house, officers moved cautiously, guns drawn. What they found stopped even seasoned veterans in their tracks. The living room was a scene of horror. Bodies sprawled across the floor, furniture overturned, blood pooling in places where laughter had filled the air just hours earlier. Upstairs, more bodies. And in the corner, the lifeless figure of the woman who had once been called his wife. One officer stepped outside to vomit in the bushes. Another whispered under his breath, shaking his head. Even for cops who had seen it all, this was different. This wasn't a random crime. This wasn't a stranger's violence. This was betrayal turned into slaughter. As the street filled with more patrol cars, detectives, and paramedics, neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering in shock. Some cried, others shook their heads, unable to process what had happened in the house they had walked past every day. Kids were ushered back inside. Reporters were already circling, their vans pulling up with cameras ready to beam the tragedy across the nation before the blood was even dry. He was lifted to his feet and guided toward the back of a cruiser. His head hung low, his eyes blank, but his body moved without resistance. For a moment, as he was pushed into the back seat, he caught sight of the house. The door still hung open, a trail of blood leading to the porch, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in his mind. It didn't feel real. It felt like watching someone else's nightmare. But it was his. An officer shut the door behind him, the slam echoing like a gavel. He sat in the cage of the back seat, wrists bound, sirens blaring around him. And as the car pulled away, he realized that whatever happened next, trial, prison, maybe even death row, it didn't matter. Because the worst part had already happened. The moment he hit play on that video, his life ended. Everything after was just aftermath. The courthouse was packed from the very first day. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones and cameras flashing as though it were the trial of the decade. In a way, it was a husband who had killed not just his wife, but nearly an entire circle of lifelong friends. It wasn't just murder, it was betrayal layered upon betrayal. The story was too sensational to ignore, and the nation was already divided. Was he a cold-blooded killer or a man pushed past the breaking point? Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Spectators filled every seat, craning their necks to catch even a glimpse of the man at the center of it all. He shuffled into the courtroom in shackles, dressed in a plain orange jumpsuit, thinner than before, his once steady gaze now hollow. Some said he looked like a monster. Others whispered he looked like a ghost. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as the former. The district attorney stood tall before the jury, voice firm, eyes unyielding. This was not a crime of passion, she declared. This was a calculated massacre. He drove to that house, armed with a loaded weapon. He made the conscious choice to pull that trigger again and again. And when he was finished, he didn't call for help. He didn't surrender out of remorse. He stood among the bodies of his friends and his wife, satisfied with the destruction he had caused. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not justice. That is murder. They presented crime scene photos, gruesome snapshots of the carnage. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes. The prosecution walked them through ballistics, autopsy reports, timelines. Each piece of evidence was laid out methodically, building the image of a man who had chosen revenge over reason, violence over restraint. But the defense fought back just as fiercely. His attorney, a seasoned trial lawyer with a reputation for saving lost causes, stepped forward with a different narrative. My client is not a monster, he said. He is a man who gave his heart, his loyalty, his entire life to people who betrayed him in the cruelest way possible. He did not plan this massacre. He was not calculating. He was broken, humiliated, stripped of everything he thought he knew. And in that moment, in the haze of grief and rage, he lost control. This is not first-degree murder. This is the tragic collapse of a man pushed beyond human limits. The defense leaned heavily on the video, playing carefully edited clips for the jury. Gasps filled the courtroom as the betrayal unfolded on screen. It wasn't just sex, it was mockery. The laughter, the taunts, the way she wore his anniversary necklace as if to twist the knife deeper. Even the jurors who tried to keep neutral expressions betrayed discomfort, some shaking their heads, others stealing glances at the defendant, as if searching for some trace of the man he used to be. Witnesses took the stand. Survivors from the house, pale and shaken, recounted the chaos of that night, the sudden eruption of violence, the screams, the desperate attempts to escape. One described the husband's eyes as empty, like he wasn't even there anymore. Another admitted through tears that they had joined in the betrayal, that they had laughed at his expense. The admission landed like a bomb in the courtroom. Then came his wife's sister, who broke down sobbing as she described the phone call she received that morning, how she couldn't believe her sister was gone, how she hated him for what he had done. Her words were raw, cutting. You didn't just kill her. You killed a family. You killed a future. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came when the defense called a psychologist who testified about betrayal trauma and the psychological collapse that can occur when a person is simultaneously humiliated and provoked beyond their coping mechanisms. The doctor explained that what happened wasn't premeditated in the traditional sense. It was an eruption. Think of a dam breaking, he told the jury. For years he held it all in: stress, devotion, blind trust. And then, in one night, all of it collapsed. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day more grueling than the last. Outside, protests gathered, some holding signs that read justice for the victims, others that read he was pushed too far. Talk shows debated endlessly. Was betrayal an excuse for slaughter? Or was it a tragedy that anyone could understand, if not forgive? The man himself sat quietly throughout, rarely looking up, rarely reacting. When asked to testify, he spoke in a low, steady voice. I didn't wake up that morning planning to kill anyone. I didn't even know I was capable of it. But when I saw that video, when I saw her in them, I felt like my life had been ripped away from me. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't myself. I don't even remember pulling the trigger half the time. I just remember the hurt. His voice cracked, but no tears came. The courtroom was silent. Closing arguments brought the tension to a peak. The prosecutor demanded the jury hold him accountable. We cannot let betrayal justify bloodshed. If we excuse this, we excuse chaos. The defense pleaded for mercy. Do not judge him as a monster. Judge him as a man destroyed by those he trusted most. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever been humiliated, you know how deep that wound cuts. The jury deliberated for 2 long days. Reporters camped outside. Crowds grew restless. The nation waited. When they finally filed back in, faces grim, the entire courtroom held its breath. The verdict was about to decide not just his fate, but how far society was willing to go in understanding the line between victim and killer. The air inside the courtroom felt suffocating when the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Every eye in the room was fixed on him, reporters gripping their pens, family members holding their breath, the defendant staring straight ahead as though already resigned to his fate. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreman said, voice steady, "We find the defendant guilty." A ripple ran through the room. Some gasped, some wept, and others nodded silently, as though justice had finally been served. The man at the center of it all barely moved. His shoulders slumped slightly, but his face remained unreadable. After everything, there was no fight left in him. The judge's gavel came down hard. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His family, what little of it remained, sobbed quietly in the back row. His wife's relatives clutched each other, tears streaming, their grief and anger spilling over. Outside the courthouse, protesters erupted. Some cheered, chanting that justice had been delivered. Others shouted angrily, holding signs that read, "He was betrayed too." Even in the moment of sentencing, the nation was still divided. As deputies led him away, chains clinking with each step, he turned his head just once toward the gallery. Not to his family, not to the jurors, but toward the empty seat where his wife might have sat if not for that night. For a fleeting second, there was something in his eyes, regret, sorrow, or maybe just emptiness. And then he was gone, swallowed into the machinery of the prison system. In the weeks that followed, the story dominated headlines. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. TV panels debated whether betrayal should ever be considered a mitigating factor in murder. Some commentators condemned him as a monster who chose violence. Others argued he was the product of unbearable humiliation, a man who snapped when pushed too far. But for the families left behind, the debates didn't matter. 5 men were dead. A woman was dead. Children would grow up without fathers, parents without children. A community once bound together by friendship was now torn apart forever. In prison, he became just another inmate. Gone were the days of backyard barbecues and laughter with friends. His world shrank to a concrete cell, 3 meals on a tray, and the echo of doors slamming shut. In interviews with psychologists, he spoke little. "The video broke me," was all he ever said. After that, I wasn't me anymore. And maybe that was the most haunting part of it all. Not just the killings, but how swiftly a life could unravel. One moment, he was the man everyone envied, with a loving wife and loyal friends. The next, he was a convicted murderer, his name forever synonymous with betrayal and bloodshed. For the rest of us, the case left behind uncomfortable questions. How much betrayal can a person endure before they break? What would any of us do if the people we trusted most turned against us? And where do we draw the line between understanding and excusing? In the end, there were no winners. Not in that courtroom, not in that community. Only ruins of marriages, friendships, families, and a man who once seemed to have it all. As the narrator of this story, I'll leave you with this. Trust is fragile. Once broken, it can turn love into hate, loyalty into violence, and an ordinary man into a monster.